So history and performative violence. So when I first set out to write the poems that eventually became How to Be Dead in a Year of Snakes, I was mainly focused on retelling the story of Joe Kum Yung and Lionel Terry. I had first come across it in a newspaper article, and I was really surprised that I hadn't heard of them before, and it felt like to me a very significant moment in Aotearoa's history that should have been more well known. So my focus was to retell the story and shed some more light on it. But the more research I did and the more I tried to find out about Joe Kum Yung, I realized that in some way he had been sidelined in the story, that the focus was very much on Lionel Terry, what he did and his beliefs and why he committed this act of violence. So my thinking shifted from retelling the story to reclaiming the story and giving Joe Kum Yung a voice back, so that he wasn't just seen as this footnote in Lionel Terry's life story. So I knew that I was going to have to write about the murder itself and include it in the collection, but I also didn't want to dwell too much on it, because I think to do so would have been another way of giving Lionel Terry more screen time, and I wanted to unshackle Joe Kum Yung from just always being the victim of that murder. So I used this as an opportunity to write around the murder, to sort of show the social and historical context of what it would have been like for Joe Kum Yung to arrive in Aotearoa at that time, and what it was like for Chinese people, given that there was such a strong and vocal anti-Chinese sentiment at the time. And I also decided to draw from Chinese beliefs and customs around death and the afterlife. So even though the murder does take place in the book, the bulk of the book is actually the aftermath, and looking at what it might have been like for Joe Kum Yung to be caught between worlds in the afterlife. So yeah, rather than just focus on the murder and sort of making a big deal about it, sort of writing around it and showing the context of how something like that could have taken place. And as to whether or not poetry is a form of symbolic justice, I would say that I think it's one aspect perhaps of seeking justice or symbolic justice, given that it's a form of truth-telling and that it can be like an alternate record of history. Poetry can be a way of recording what's happening so that we and future generations don't forget and capture what it's like in the moment. But given at this time there are so many atrocities in the world that are playing out in real time. We can live stream the genocide in Gaza on our phones. It feels to me like justice isn't being served, and the perpetrators and the people responsible for these atrocities aren't being held accountable. So poetry does still have a power to capture the moment and play some part in seeking justice by constantly reminding people and being a point where people can sort of return to remember and discuss what's actually happening out there. Camp and queer resistance. So the first thing I would say is that I never considered that this poem could be read as being about internalized homophobia, but having revisited it, I can kind of see how that interpretation can be taken from it. And yeah, there are aspects of the poem which I guess do speak to some forms of internalized homophobia. I wrote this poem as a way to interrogate and explore those expectations or those stereotypes of what it means to be queer, and and to present that queerness to the world. I think about how in the gay community often there's this pressure or this expectation to ascribe a label to yourself to say, which tribe of gay men do you belong to, and often these expectations and these tribes are based on things like, how masculine you are, or how feminine you are, or your body type. And I really wanted to just sort of interrogate that, because I don't think it's necessarily a useful thing to impose on people, especially those who are still coming to terms with their queerness and coming to terms with how they might present that part of themselves to the world. And I think it's ridiculous that there is this gatekeeping within the queer community sometimes, which sort of like prevents people from fitting in, because they're not masculine enough, or because they don't necessarily listen to or watch things that queer people are supposed to be interested in. So yeah, that can really create feelings of isolation and frustration, which could lead to forms of internalized homophobia, because you might be seeing yourself as not enough to belong to the queer community. So I guess my use of humor and irreverence in a poem like this is in a way almost like a Trojan horse, because I want to disarm the reader, and I want to get them comfortable before really hitting them with that sobering note, or that feeling of pathos. And I think humor is really, really powerful in this way. And this poem is from a book called Supermodel Minority, which is very angry and very much filled with rage about the state of the world. And using humor in this poem was a way of, I guess, balancing that anger and that rage. As far as satire's limits as a political tool, interestingly, I think we're at a point in time where satire perhaps isn't as effective as it has been in the past. I've seen, how the most ridiculous and outlandish examples of satire in the past, 5 or 10 years, are now actually very much our, reality. It's scary how, something we joked about is now, actually happening in the world. So perhaps that's where the limit is, that, reality catches up and it blurs the line between, satire and what's actually happening. I also think we're living in an age where people are, finding it difficult to actually distinguish what is satire and what isn't, because of the spread of misinformation and disinformation, which actually forces us to be a little bit more wary about what we read and what we see. Body and public space. So I've always been quite interested in this idea of personal myth, and it was a very big focus of my second collection, He's So Mask, and to some extent Supermodel Minority. And the thing that's always been quite interesting to me is how and why we create personal myth, and what drives us to revisit and revise it. For me as a writer, personal myth has always been a useful tool to construct and analyze my identities through poetry, and at the same time look at how revisiting the past can change your understanding or perception of the present, and vice versa. And in the case of this particular poem, The Other Side of the Glass, what I really wanted to do was to look at that trip to City Mardi Gras and understand its significance in my coming to terms with my sexuality and my queerness, and my eventual decision to come out. I remember thinking that Mardi Gras represented this life that I could live, but at the same time I was wondering whether I would ever be able to live such a life freely, or whether I deserved to live a life like that. And this is something that has come up a number of times in my poetry about my queerness, is confronting these feelings of worthiness. I wondered, and sometimes still wonder, whether I am allowed to have these feelings of desire and attraction, whether I myself will ever be desired in such a way. And, looking at that moment now, with many years behind me and so much more experience and understanding of myself, I question whether that moment still has that significance in my life. Going to Sydney Mardi Gras and being in a space like that was the first time that I really did experience a queer space like that. I had been in gay bars in New Zealand before, but for me those experiences were still shrouded in secrecy and shame, whereas in Sydney at Mardi Gras everything was just so public and so open. The feeling I had was this overwhelming feeling of liberation, and I guess I've carried that feeling with me since then, and I've used that as a yardstick to compare my experiences in other queer spaces. And this idea of personal myth and this ability to revisit the past and reshape what you experienced does allow us to then look at things with more clarity rather than just looking at it through rose-colored glasses. And I now like to think that my understanding of what a queer space is has changed and broadened since Sydney Mardi Gras, and is so much more inclusive than what I experienced back then. Language and silence. So silence has become a really important aspect of my creative practice as a poet, both in the process of writing poetry, but also in the actual poetry itself. When I think about silence, I think about being present, and that has really helped me in my development as a poet over the years. Because I think without it, you can't really observe the world in such a way that allows you to pick up on those really important details and ideas and experiences that you can then translate successfully onto the page as poetry. For me, silence is that space where the truth can grow and slowly reveal itself to you as a poet and as a reader of poetry. Silence has also been a important motivating factor for me as a poet, especially when I first started writing poetry. I noticed that there was this absence or lack of certain voices and stories in Aotearoa's literature, for example, Chinese voices and experiences. And at first I saw this as perhaps a lack of interest or a lack of value in these stories. But then I realized that this wasn't the case, and that in fact we needed to speak up and tell our stories so that we could address this silence and fill this void of Chinese New Zealand voices and stories. So that is something that really motivated me to write about the things that I've written about, like the murder of Joe Kum Yung. And the same can kind of be said to some extent of queer writers and writing in Aotearoa, because even though we've had queer writers for decades, because of society's attitudes towards queer people, these writers weren't often really read as such or talked about as such. And it's really, I guess, in the last couple of decades since those attitudes have changed and that there is more acceptance of queer people, that we've seen this growing visibility of queer writers in Aotearoa, and writers who are more bold in how they talk about queerness. And for me, this this increase in visibility in both queer writing and writing by Asian New Zealanders has really inspired me and motivated me to continue pushing against the silence that has been there historically. So I think a poem and poetry is a space to both break branches and mend them. One cannot exist without the other. And as a poet, I remain curious about the role of poetry to challenge these silences and to challenge this historical erasure of queer and Asian voices. Imperfect futures. So when I'm asked to talk about what poetry can do, or if I'm running a creative writing workshop, something that I often do say is that the power of poetry allows us to imagine the world or the future that we want to live in. And I think this resonates with some people because it helps them to see that poetry allows us to process what is happening in the world around us, as well as what's happening in our lives, and maybe even perhaps offer a way through or a solution. So in that respect, I do think that poetry can offer futures beyond pain and nostalgia because of its ability for us to challenge the narratives that are being set by those in power or those in control, and to create something akin to hope for us to hold on to. This is something that I wrote about in Supermodel Minority, which is a book about imagining a world where there is no racism or homophobia or transphobia, but at the same time questioning whether such a world is attainable or even reasonable to wish for. In terms of my legacy as poet laureate, I actually don't think that this is something that I can envision for myself. Obviously, I hope that my work continues to be read and that there is a place for it in the future. But yeah, I don't think it's something that I can particularly control or dictate. What I do feel fortunate about is that, being poet laureate, I am in this line of poets who will undoubtedly leave a legacy, but in terms of what my own legacy looks like, that's anyone's guess, and it's not something I try to think too much about, because I think to do so would actually have a detrimental effect on how I write and what I write in the future.